Welcome to the Upfront Podcast, where you get your weekly dose of upfront discussions with people from all around the world. On this episode, my guest is Sam, who goes by the pronouns of they and them. For the listeners that are not aware, this means Sam does not identify as on the binary spectrum, meaning neither female or male. Sam and their family moved to Israel from California in the United States when they were 11 years old and became an advocate for intersectional disability and mental health. They call themselves the Disabledreamer, which is also their Instagram handle. Sam is a writer and is currently also studying. We will talk about gender identity, disability, mental health, and how Sam handles living with cerebral palsy. This is the second part of this interview. If you haven't listened to the first part, please go back to last week's episode and listen to that first. So I'm curious, when and how did you notice that you're not on the binary spectrum?
Oh, wow. The binary spectrum took a very long time. It took me a very long time to come out just as not straight, like as lesbian first. And then once I came out, I was like, oh, duh. All these other things that have happened to you for like, and how you felt for like 15 years was like, you're queer. But I didn't have the words for it for many years. My friend actually was like, oh, you're not out of the closet yet? You're totally queer. You're totally lesbian. I was like, what do you mean? And then I sat with it for a week and like did research and I was like, oh, that's everything. Oh, what was it? 2017 that I came out? I think I'm 26 now. I don't know, 20, a little bit younger than 20. Time's a flat circle. I'm so bad with figuring out how old I was. Yeah, probably about 20. So that was the start of it. And then I was actually sitting on the same friend's couch, like almost a year later, not a year later, probably 8 months later. And she's like, I don't think you're like cisgender. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, I don't know. You just seem to have a lot of struggles with being female and being a woman. And I was like, how do you know all these things?
That's a good friend.
It's a great friend. She's a great friend. She's one of those friends who's just very honest and not in a mean way, but in a way that really like we could really show each other like facets of ourselves that we couldn't really figure out and we were able to really share. So then I went on a whole process of research and I'm very much like, I'm going to go read everything about it. But then within like a week, I started using like the pronouns they, them. And I was like, I don't know, I haven't figured it out yet, but these pronouns feel so much better using them than she, her. So I think that was a big part of kind of starting. And it just like, I felt more myself in my body. It's definitely like still a journey, but I think a lot of it was then within that kind of figuring out, because there's some people who will use all pronouns and some people like I was very much like, no, they, them. But in Hebrew, I actually prefer to be like misgendered in a way and be called by like male pronouns than female pronouns, which is like a weird trip I have to figure out because there isn't really non-binary. Like they, them in Hebrew doesn't exist with the language being gendered, which is definitely a struggle. But I think it was less of a struggle to figure out how to be figure out that I was non-binary because I had already kind of broken down my internal structure of sexuality, who I was sexuality-wise. So it became easier to kind of almost follow the same path of like, okay, break everything down, figure out, and then look back and be like, oh, these are all these places in which I never felt comfortable being male or female and kind of being that alien kind of version of non-gender and feeling much more comfortable in that. It even allowed me to feel much more comfortable in just, I don't know, in just all the ways, kind of fitting more in on yourself.
Yeah. I feel like it's already difficult for young people anyways to sort of figure out who they are. What do you recommend personally for people when they feel like they don't identify as male or female?
So I think you won't even necessarily, I mean, some people, even as young children, will, come out and fully come out as transgender, all these different things. I think it's about listening to the inner voice and inner kid in your thing and not just dismissing it as like, oh, I just feel uncomfortable in my skin. Okay, why do you feel uncomfortable in your skin? And I think it's realizing you don't have to figure out all the answers right away. I think it's even allowing yourself to be in that questioning phase gives so much more space to that person inside of you who's saying, I don't fit into whatever box I've been put in by society. And it's not like I figured out that Shabbos afternoon sitting on her couch that I was completely non-binary and understood what it was and completely embraced the title of it and, owned it as part of my identity. But it was really like opening the door to having that space to just sit in the uncomfortable. And I think as a society, we struggle with even sitting and being uncomfortable, right? Because then we have to figure everything out right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you have to do that. I think it's embracing, this doesn't feel right. I feel uncomfortable in this. Okay, why do I feel uncomfortable with it? What can I do to make myself feel slightly more comfortable in the uncomfortable? Like I switched right then pretty much to using they, them pronouns, but I hadn't figured anything else out about understanding the non-binary. I just knew that as soon as she used those pronouns with me, I felt better in my skin. So I was like, hey, great, this is what I'm doing.
What did it feel like before when somebody referred to you as she, her, or with like different pronouns that weren't yours?
It was a lot of like playing a part. It was like, yes, how can I help you? I'm a female. I'm a girl. Da 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 da. Right. And like kind of it's
Mm.
always also feeling like you have to fit into so much more of society's version of a girl, right? Like even though I felt uncomfortable in dresses and skirts, and I had already been wearing pants for a long time, I wasn't religious and etc. So, but I still had like dresses and stuff that I'd go home and wear and whatever. And like every time I tried to get rid of skirts that I had in my closet at home, my mother would be like, well, one day. And it took me like coming out and crying to her, sitting, she still doesn't get the non-binary thing, but she's come to learn that that's kind of who I am. But it took me sitting and crying with her on like the pier when we were talking about the wedding and saying, I'm showing up as me to this wedding, which means I'm showing up in a custom suit and I'm going to look freaking fly, but I'm not putting on a dress like I did 5 years ago for my best friend's wedding because I'm not
Mm.
that person anymore. And so it's also finding those small points of really owning who you are. And I still struggle. I still have clothes in my closet that I haven't worn in years that I struggle to get rid of because I'm like, and they are uncomfortable when I wear them and I feel like they're not my identity, but also I still struggle with the idea of like, okay, empty out your whole closet and only go buy like gender neutral, more male style clothing. So it's definitely a journey. I think it's also realizing that you don't have to have everything figured out.
Can you talk me through your process of coming to understand your own identity and accepting it as it is and all of that?
Oh gosh, I feel like it's so not a straightforward process.
Hmm.
Um, in a
It's
way, I
also a
think
big
just
question.
yeah, I'm like, oh my gosh, explain everything. I think I'm very much that person who I really don't jive with my life when it doesn't fit who I am internally. Like I really struggle and I think that's part of my depression and anxiety and I fall into that when I'm not like living my alignment in that way. So, I mean, it really was a lot based off of this friend who really kind of was able to kind of show me why I'm unaligned with my life. I don't really know how to explain it because it's so much of like just sitting in bed in the middle of the night and like processing how you feel. And then for me, it's
Mm.
also listening to books by queer people um who like there's a book by Ash Hardell and they run down a bunch of terms of like in the LGBTQ community. And I still don't know a lot. I like honestly have been learning a lot more over like Instagram and TikTok about queer identities and communities. I don't always necessarily feel like it's figuring it out completely. I don't know if that's even, I mean, that might be possible. I think I'm a person who kind of evolves and I don't know if you ever really figure yourself out completely. I think you figure yourself out at different points in different ways and to different extents. And I think that kind of evolves also. And I think also the pressure of figuring yourself out completely makes it so much harder, right? Because then people are like, okay, fine, what's your identity? And then if you change your identity and it evolves with you, because that's what it does, society is like, well, you're already, lesbian. Like, why? You have to be non-binary also. And it's like, no, that's who I am. But society really struggles with continued evolution. So I think
Mm.
it's
Also fluidity, right? I think is difficult in a sense. Like you keep having to explain what it's all about, right?
So I think not everyone goes through those stages. I think they would do
Mm.
them it would do them good to go through those stages. I think a lot of people are fearful of sitting in that uncomfortable stage of I don't know.
Mm.
In many different ways. And I think that's the same in many different ways in society. I mean, I've noticed that many ways. People are like, "Oh, you're like actually liberal," and will like hear what both sides have to say and then make a decision. And I'm like, "Yeah, but that's kind of how you have to live your own life of kind of hearing all the parts of you and figuring out what works for you." I think people just struggle with change. I think we've also seen that with the pandemic is that people
Mm,
like can't handle when the world evolves, which leads to a lot of mental breakdowns, etc. But I think because I think that's also part of why I survived I evolve all the time. So the fact that the world evolved, okay, but I internally evolve. So I understand how to break down the system that's broken around me and be like, okay, that system no longer works. That system no longer exists. How am I going to live in the new system? I think people just don't do well with duality or the ability. It's really the unknown. I think there's a process in embracing the fact that you don't know and learning more and telling yourself, I'm learning more, which also means I'm learning more of the things that I don't know. And within that, you have space to grow. And I think it's very hard for many people to sit in that uncomfortable space of growing and really embrace that, which I think the world would do better if we could sit there more often.
yeah, absolutely. So, did your path of coming to find your own identity and gender identity and everything like surrounding that, did that have an impact on your mental health? Did that in a way help you, or was that even more of a struggle?
Absolutely, at the end of the day, it has helped my mental health immensely. Was there a complete struggle during the process? Absolutely, and I think that might have been harder because of my mental health struggles, but I think my mental health struggles also ended up giving me a space to figure that out, right? When I went to the hospital and I was having a whole internal breakdown about figuring out that I was genderqueer and non-binary, I was able to find that safe space for myself where all I was required to do was not hurt myself and not kill myself and sit in a safe space that handed me my meds every hour when I needed them, handed me food, and gave me a really safe space in order to kind of sit and collapse my entire internal self and kind of rebuild it, not even rebuild it completely, but rebuild a new structure in which I'm living. So I do think actually my mental health struggles, they also give me a space and kind of wording to be like, what's going on isn't working for me. Then sit in that safe space and be able to have the time to really word it out and realize that it's a complete gender like meltdown and what needs to be rebuilt from that.
Do you feel like it would help people who are also non-binary to maybe have a therapist or a psychiatrist, for that matter, who's also non-binary, or is that not necessarily something that like that you need to have in order to feel seen and maybe understood better?
So I feel like it totally depends. I was actually seeing a different psychiatrist when I went into the hospital in September when I had this gender breakdown, and he did not understand it. And when
Mm,
I brought up to him, he was like, "No, we like spoke about it." I was like, "No, you completely invalidated my feelings and you didn't know how to deal with it." And we mostly spoke in Hebrew and he like made a joke of like, "Well, I don't know how to speak to you in gender non-conforming terms because like it's Hebrew and it's gendered." And I was like, "Okay, but you can't be a therapist and like respond to your person who comes out to you as non-binary in this way."
mhm,
So I actually switched to a therapist who's in the LGBTQ community, actually in the hospital, who like broke up with one therapist, started with another therapist. Um, but I think it can be important, especially on the beginning of your gender journey, to have someone in the community. Now, it could be a therapist that's part of the LGBTQ community. It could be a therapist that's trans or non-binary. It could also be a support group or support network at your local LGBTQ center if you don't have a therapist. Um, that can be that person. I think the most important is not to have someone who doesn't get it and who can't handle it. Like my therapist couldn't hear that he couldn't get it. And I was like, if you can't even hear the response that I'm telling you and you don't understand me and you aren't validating me, then we can't work together on this journey. But I don't necessarily think they have to be queer. I think there are good therapists who are able to hold space and hold space for your transition and evolution that aren't necessarily queer.
So do you feel like in the States and in Israel, it is inclusive and considerate in like everyday life?
So I can't speak to what it's like in America because even when I went back for
Hmm.
a year in 2015, I actually was not even out as LGBTQ in the community. A lot of other people actually, like, there's so many stories of my coach being like, "Oh, don't worry, you'll figure it out, but you're definitely not straight." Um, like my taxi driver being like, "Yeah, you're not straight." But I was like, "What are you talking about?" So I really wasn't ready for it. So I mean, I think to an extent they were very accepting because they didn't even really make me have to come out for them to be accepting of where I was and them having figured other things out before me. I think the Israeli community for non-binary, they struggle. I don't even I feel like within our LGBTQ community, the more Anglos understand it better. I think the Israeli LGBTQ community understands that it exists, but because structurally this society is built in such a binary way, and the language, like, to the extent of it really
Yeah, it doesn't
being
help,
this.
right? Hmm.
No, it doesn't. There's actually been
Hmm.
some research done that people were talking about how a lot of the young non-binary children, teens in Israel actually speak in English because they feel more validated. Um, so
Oh.
I think it's a lot harder in Israel. But I also kind of figured it out a lot later, and I'm not so stuck in Israeli society in a way. I'm kind of on the bridge of it both. So it's harder being on the bridge, but I also think like my queer community is much more Anglo based. Like I have a queer community on campus and it's much more Israeli based, but even there sometimes I'll feel like I use she her terms in Hebrew because I like don't you like using really mixed terms because I'm like I'm not either, and I just find it
Hmm.
harder to use like both male and female pronouns. So I use she her in Hebrew, but it's very like then I'll write they them in English on like our sticker, and like the people who are able to use they them terms in English make it so much easier and more inclusive to feel more fit in.
Yeah, I think the language helps a lot actually. Or in other cases, it's very limiting, where that even becomes like difficult, I think, for people to like adapt easily, you know?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the attitude in Israel that I've also come across between some social workers and different people, they're like, well, if there aren't terms for it in Hebrew, it doesn't exist. And I was like, Hebrew is such a limited language. Like, I think it wasn't started with any basis for it, and it is originally taken from biblical terms, and we all know how the Bible works. It's like, well, it's easy, it doesn't work, so we don't have to accept it. I was like, no, it doesn't work, so we have to evolve.
Yeah, definitely. Have you personally been like discriminated against for your identity or your gender identity?
No, I feel like with the intersectionality of being queer and disabled, I feel like I'm usually discriminated against much more just disability based. Like it's not accessible, we don't really care. So I haven't been discriminated against from the LGBTQ sense of the community, but I also feel like I don't really put myself out there in a whole lot of ways kind of to be discriminated against, I guess. I'm very clearly queer. Like I have very short hair. I like to dress in much more androgynous outfits. I mean, to me, it's just like I like business casual. That's like I live in the wrong country because to me, a good outfit is like a button down, a jacket, and slacks. It's like no one in this country wears that, not even in high tech or anywhere else. Um, but I haven't actually personally really dealt with discrimination. I deal with much more with actually taxi drivers who end up feeling bad because also I will get into a taxi and they'll like when I'm getting in, they'll use male pronouns and then I'll sit in the car and I guess my face is quite feminine, although I never wear makeup or anything. And they'll be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I was like, "No, it actually felt really nice that I didn't look female to you for 5 minutes."
Mm.
And I'm always kind of disappointed when they figure out and kind of like switch to female. I was like, no, it was fine.
How did you first find out about your diagnosis of cerebral palsy?
So I was diagnosed at 2 years old, so before I kind of had any understanding, but I was kind of unofficially diagnosed by a family friend when she saw
Mm.
my mother like changing my diaper and I was arching off the back of the thing with like sitting my legs in a W position and she's like, "Oh, don't you know that's like classic cerebral palsy." So we went back to the doctor and a bunch of, different tests kind of concluded that I had cerebral palsy. but I don't really remember that diagnosis in a way. That was before I was really cognizant of it.
Yeah, of course, at 2 years of age, right? I mean, that would be amazing if you'd actually remember that age, but yeah,
I
I
feel like it's
understand
kind
that.
of a blessing that we don't always remember everything that happens that early.
What are daily like issues that you're dealing with nowadays, and how do you manage these?
So these days, I think a lot more of my disability issues, it intersects with chronic pain. A big part of cerebral palsy, especially in mine, is called spastic cerebral palsy. So my
Hmm.
muscles can tense up, and it will impact the joints a lot. So a lot of my times I'll either wake up in the morning and like stand up to go to the bathroom and my legs can sometimes collapse under me, or just I'll have joints that will have searing pain. So that is a lot of the issues. Then I'll struggle with balance, and I struggle with a lot of like trusting myself. It's always like a gamble when I get up and I like put my feet down in the morning. I was like, okay, let's see if anything hurts or is caught or is not going to work. So I think it leads to a lot more of just imbalance and kind of with pain for joint pain, but that's kind of, I think, the biggest issue. I mean, I use a wheelchair. I can walk, but as I said, I don't trust it. So I have a wheelchair, which is great, but it also, like tears up your shoulders because you're using it constantly.
Mm.
So that leads to like accessibility issues, but on the day to day, it's more so just, I think, more to do with pain is kind of the biggest pain, and imbalance is probably the biggest two issues that cerebral palsy shows up for me in my day-to-day life.
But can you take any sort of medication to help with the chronic pain?
I'm always anti-pain meds. When I was younger, I had a surgery when I was 5 years old, and my father couldn't handle me being in pain. So basically, anytime I would start crying out or being in pain, when I was at home with still my cast on and everything, he would just, shoot me up with morphine, basically like how they had done at the hospital. And I absolutely hated it. I even in the hospital, I used to like put my hand over the IV line to like make sure it didn't go in. And then they finally caught on to me, like trying to not let the morphine go in. They're like, no, no, it'll help you. So I've been very scarred and very not into taking pain meds. So I've been very anti that. And I've had certain doctors who are like, yeah, just smoke weed. We'll write you a prescription. Medical cannabis has a place. And I have lots of friends and people I know who use it. When I've spoken to different psychiatrists, they've all said that it's never been something A that I felt comfortable using, and B, anytime I've really spoken to a psychiatrist, it's been something that they're like, it could honestly harm your mental health a lot more than you already have it with. So I don't take pain meds. I think sometimes it's to my detriment. But also I'm a person who struggles with swallowing, and I already have to take like my mental health medication. I was
Mm.
also supposed to try taking this other medication for something, and like I tried for like 20 minutes and I just couldn't swallow it. I have very bad gag reflex. I think also partially to do with the spasticity. So I'm always trying to take less medication, not more. But that is like a very personal choice, and I have been handed options, but I also just really don't want to get hooked on pain meds either.
Is there any sort of therapy that you can do, like on a daily or weekly basis or anything like that?
So yeah, so physical therapy is always helpful. Last summer, like July and August, I did like an intense 3 times a week, 2 times a week at the hospital for 4 hours. I did physical therapy, occupational therapy, like swim therapy. So nowadays, the best way for me to help myself really is like physical activity. So I've actually recently, like really recently, gotten back into rowing. I used to row many years ago, and I've come back to that. So doing intense physical activity and then stretching and moving your body is really the best medicine. Like the majority of doctors who I've gone to yearly as an adult, they're like, yeah, just do physical activity. That's kind of the best medicine for it.
Oh, that's great that it helps. Can I ask you, are you getting some sort of like financial support from the government? Because I've heard that in Israel that is sort of problematic too.
So it takes a while because Israel just takes a while to do things. And I do get governmental help. I get governmental help in a few ways. I get government help for my disability through Bituach Leumi, right? So we went through
Mm.
the whole process. We proved that I was disabled and used a wheelchair. and I get money from them. And then they also have a program that's called like Shikum. It's like rehabilitation, and they rehabilitate disabled people and all these other types of people, and they like put you through testing and whatever, and they'll pay for your education in school. So I'm also getting funding through them. Is it simple? No. Is it a lot of paperwork and fighting for your things and proving them? Yeah, but at the end of the day, they do give you a lot more help than I think a lot of other countries do. And it is incredibly helpful. It's kind of how I live independently at this point because of that financing.
I can only imagine, especially if you're doing a lot of physical therapy, which helps you, then you have to commit a lot of your time to that, right?
Yeah, it's definitely being disabled is kind of like a full-time job on its own, and then like mental health and schooling and everything else. It's definitely, and it's kind of just juggling. Like I don't always have all the things up in the air going. It's not physically possible. So I'm always kind of dropping things and picking them up as I can drop something else. So I think that illusion of balance also is kind of very hard. Um, but it's kind of noticing which is like the most acute. How can I see if I can balance it with doing, not the maximum amount I could be doing? Like I don't train 6 days a week. I train 3 or 4 days a week for a couple of hours, depending on my schedule. So it's kind of figuring out how to balance, but it definitely isn't always easy to balance all the things that I need to do to take care of myself for sure.
You're also an advocate for disability awareness. So, what do you think is most important for people to understand what it's like to live with a disability and how they can be a better friend or, how they can help better?
People are always like, "Oh, you became a disability advocate." And I was like, "Yeah, because people use the disabled bathroom and then I can't go to the bathroom in my 15-minute break on campus when there's one
Mm-hmm.
disabled stall in an entire floor and like there's four other stalls you can use." I didn't become, people are like, "Oh, you became a disability advocate." I was like, "Yeah, I became a disability advocate so much more so because society doesn't know how to behave rather than because I want to be advocating for like soap and disabled bathrooms, like, and not parking your, motorcycle on the ramp part of the sidewalk that doesn't even exist in all places." I think it has to do a lot with lack of awareness and there's this assumption that there's no disabled people anywhere, right? And like they won't need it. I mean, I even had someone who I was walking with into a building. I then went to like use the restroom a minute later and the door was closed. And then the person came out and it was the person who I just walked into the building with. And I was like, there's another bathroom for women that's not wheelchair accessible that you could have used. You literally even know that I'm in the building, but there's just a lack of awareness, I think, a lot of it.
And then along with that goes like a lot of accessibility issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like even if luckily we have a wheelchair accessible bathroom. I mean, like half the times at one of the gyms I use, they like use their wheelchair accessible bathroom as storage. And like the cleaning ladies are always sitting in there and are always so annoyed when I knock on the door because they always have the door locked to like use the restroom. And I've told the gym a few times, I was like, I don't want to get attitude for using the one wheelchair accessible bathroom that you have here because you've decided that you can use it as storage and as the cleaner's like hangout room. So it's definitely like a struggle with that.
Mm. Yeah, and I feel like it also has a lot to do with like the attitude that you're met with, right? Sounds like it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so much more of like, oh my gosh, we're doing you a favor that it's accessible, or I have to get help. And people are all like, well, we'll just help you in. I was like, why don't you just not have a stair in the front or have a ramp? Um,
Yeah.
Also, I've dealt with so many times. I mean, most people don't even put if they're accessible anywhere. But sometimes even if they do, I've been to a place where like on Google Maps they said they're wheelchair accessible, and then we got there and like there's a huge step to get into the building. I was like, I don't understand how you claim you're wheelchair accessible. And then I went to another place and they're like, yeah, we have a wheelchair accessible bathroom. And then I got there and I was like, this is not wheelchair accessible. Now I'm ambulatory, so I got out of my chair and went to the bathroom and it was fine. But for people who aren't ambulatory, it would have been a huge mess. And it's like, it's this double-edged sword of like, well, I'm glad you're writing you're accessible on your website, but you need to hire people to like actually make sure you're accessible.
Do you feel like it is becoming like people are becoming generally more aware nowadays, or is it going backwards for some reason?
I think people are becoming more aware because disabled people are speaking up more. and having more platforms to do so, like Instagram and TikTok, and all my friends, most of my disabled friends, like we've become unofficial advocates because like we deal with so much ableism that we kind of have to. And like I enjoy educating children and different things like that. Like I love running into kids in the store and they like ask their mom what's wrong or whatever, and then I can come in and like answer and say I use my arms instead of my legs in the store because my legs don't work as well. But dealing with parents, I think, and adults who have a lot more preconceived notion and kind of don't even see you at all is a lot harder. Like children have this natural curiosity, but as adults, I feel like a lot of people assume like you're getting one up on them being disabled. And it's like having an accessible bathroom. They're like, what is like so much nicer than the other ones. I was like, we just can't fit in the other ones. Like, I don't need a bathroom to be a spa. I just need to be able to get my wheelchair in and for me to be able to transfer to the toilet. Like, I think people assume that you're getting special treatment when like accessibility isn't special treatment. It's like equity to create an equal world. Like we're not getting something better than the rest of society. It's what we need to interact with society.
Yeah. What do you feel like we as a society, like all of us sort of and all of our listeners could do to make the world in the best sense possible more inclusive for all people?
So that's a big thing. I think accessibility wise, I'll start with
Mm-hmm.
I think they're actually all start with the same thing, like gender and disability and accessibility, right? It's seeing the other person, and it's seeing the other person even if they're not there, right? It's using the correct pronouns even if the person isn't even in the room. So then when you're interacting with the person, you're using the correct pronouns. And it's realizing that you will have deaf or blind people come into your restaurant. So you need to have Braille for blind people, a Braille menu, and you need to have a wheelchair accessible bathroom because there are wheelchair accessible people. And it's not using the blue parking for 5 seconds because you assume that no disabled person will need to use the blue parking within the 20 seconds that you're using it, or the 5 minutes that you're running into the store for, because like obviously disabled people aren't going outside. Like it's assuming that there are disabled people around, and it's trying not to make their life harder. Like assume that they're around and just noticing the small things, right? It's also just having your eyes open. I've had so many people reach out to me on Instagram and different friends and people who become friends who are like, we just notice now when people are parked on the ramp part of the sidewalk. And we notice when people are using the disabled bathroom that don't need to be, right? So a lot of it is noticing. And then I've had a friend who she's redoing her house and she decided to make it super wheelchair accessible. And people were like, why'd you make it wheelchair accessible? Like, is your grandmother sick or whatever? And she's like, no, I'm just making it wheelchair accessible for everyone. She's like, why is the only reason people are making things accessible or assume that they're making things accessible is because like someone's grandmother? She's like, no, houses and apartments should just be made accessible to begin with. We should make elevators that are wide enough for people to go in a wheelchair. Like all houses should be accessible. And she's like, it's surprising that there's such a shock of like, why are you making it accessible if like you don't have someone in your house who needs a wheelchair? And she's like, because people might also. And she's like, also, I don't want to have to explain that I know you and I might want you to come over to my house and make it easier for you. She's like, because as a society, we should just want to make things better for everyone all the time. She's like, my life will also be easier with less stairs around. Like, it's not people, like to make it so unique. And I'm like, but you guys all use elevators and you all like to use the wheelchair bathroom. So you enjoy
Exactly.
and use the ramps on campus and park your bikes on them. You use all the accessibility that disabled people have fought for. So when it's like, well, why do you need these special accommodations? And it's like, no, but you use all the accommodations that disabled people fought for because it makes your life easier also. So don't fight it, just embrace it.
I hope a lot of people who are not aware enough are going to listen to this and maybe next time consider how they behave, what pronouns they use, and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was so much fun.
Thank you so much, Sam. If you feel like you need to talk to someone or if you are in need of some kind of support, please reach out to your national or local helpline. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on any new episodes. We will be back next week.